but it is a City Club of Portland. I want to welcome you all again today and ask you to remember to please turn down your cell phones and other pagers. Next Friday Forum, February 24th, is the State of the State when Governor Ted Kulongoski returns here to address citizens across Oregon from our podium. I came to the table and there was a sign saying, "Doug, State of the State is sold out." So if you've bought your tickets already, the event will be held up in the 4th floor ballroom. Next Friday as well is our final Friday, which is our open house at City Club Commons. That'll be from 4:30 to 6 o'clock p.m. We hold these informal social hours on the last Friday of every month. The adjacent Cafe Voila is open late. We'll have a cash bar, an interesting art exhibit, and it's an opportunity to meet club leaders, staff, and other members. On Monday, February 27th, our book club, Citizens Read, will meet at 7 p.m. at City Club Commons to discuss The Kite Runner. This is part of Multnomah County Library's Everybody Reads campaign, and Library Director Molly Raphael will lead the discussion. You can buy the book today at the registration table or from the City Club office, and if you do that, the City Club receives 10% of the proceeds. As always, details on these events and others can be found in your weekly bulletin or online at www.pdxcityclub.org. We have new sponsors this quarter who make broadcast of City Club possible. They are CH2M Hill, Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt, and West Coast Bank. Would you join me in thanking our sponsors? To our topic. Human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to transport persons across boundaries to exploit them for their labor. Within the past decade, human trafficking has reemerged as an issue of major concerns for the government and the public. The best-known form of human trafficking is for prostitution. Official estimates indicate that 45,000 to 50,000 women and children are trafficked into the U.S. every year from many parts of the world, and that the average age of victims is reported to be 20 years old. According to the Daywalka Foundation, this form of modern-day slavery is a profitable trade that devastates lives, worsens the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and finances South Asian terrorism. But in Portland, it's more than prostitution. Willamette Week recently reported that an increasing number of young Latinos who sell drugs in Portland are also tied to human trafficking. They're lured to the U.S. with promises of work, but instead end up with a debt that must be paid in labor by selling drugs under the street under fear of violent retribution. As with prostitution, depending on how one looks at the problem, these young men are both victims and criminals. Today, the City Club welcomes 3 experts on this issue. Chris Carey will give an overview of the situation, both globally and how it relates to Portland. Chris is Executive Director of the Daywalka Foundation, a U.S.-based international non-governmental organization committed to ending human trafficking and modern-day slavery. He's also an assistant professor at Portland State University, where his expertise extends to the application of international law and policy within specific cultural contexts. He's an experienced lawyer, including serving as a deputy district attorney for Multnomah County, and has participated in numerous conferences and speaking engagements on the subject of trafficking in persons. Brian Willis will present the public health aspects of this issue. Brian is a research associate with the Daywalka Foundation. He has designed projects that collect information on the risk factors for trafficking of girls in India. And in this capacity, he recently participated in a White House meeting on public health and human trafficking matters. He's also a health advisor for ECPAT-USA, where he focuses on health policy, research, human rights, and programs to prevent the trafficking of children and mitigate the adverse health consequences of trafficking and promote the recovery of these children. Liz Rogers will talk about the local Catholic Charities' role in a federally funded local anti-trafficking task force. Liz has been working with the Catholic Charities since October 2004. Her work in the field of anti-human trafficking began in the spring of 2003 as an advisory board of the first anti-human trafficking program in the state of Oregon. Liz is active in community organizing and advocacy in various collectives and community groups, working towards social justice and empowerment for Asian and Pacific Islander community members. So I'll begin with Chris.
Good afternoon. I want to take this opportunity to thank City Club, and particularly Melody Rose, for taking the time out and putting this program together, and you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to address what I think is one of the most dangerous threats to human rights of the 21st century. I also want to thank Portland State University for welcoming me and my family back to Oregon after 2 years, and not only allowing me to pursue an academic career, but to pursue something that's become a passion of mine, and that is engaging in the fight against human trafficking. I'm going to do 3 brief things in my speech today. I'm going to talk about the overview of trafficking, both internationally and domestically. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the foundation, and if there's any time left in my 10 minutes, I'll talk about some things that you can do if you're so motivated. And if we don't get to that part, we might get to that part in questions and answers. Trafficking of persons, as Doug pointed out, this is a worldwide problem, with trafficking networks documented in every country on the globe. There are 2 main sources for the legal definition of human trafficking. One comes from a United Nations protocol, the other comes from something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, which is the federal statute that criminalizes this behavior in the United States. But as Doug pointed out, at a base level, what this does is it makes it illegal to transport, transfer, harbor, or receive in any way, through force or threat of force, coercion, deception, or fraud, a human being for the purpose of exploitation. And exploitation is simply any type of work exploitation or forced labor. So it could be agricultural work, it could be factory work, it could be commercial sexual exploitations, or another thing that we see in the international arena is the taking of humans for their organs. Significantly, it is important to note that it does not involve the movement across borders. There can be internal trafficking, where the Daywalka Foundation does much of its work in South Asia, particularly in India. This is a particular problem, internal trafficking. Unfortunately, we also have this problem here in the United States. Numbers, as you can imagine, are very difficult to come by. Indeed, there is a current debate on how you count hidden populations, and that's what trafficking victims and survivors are, hidden populations. But the U.S. State Department estimates that 600 to 800,000 people a year are trafficked across international borders. The International Labor Organization estimates that upwards of 12 million people live as slaves as a result of trafficking in the world today. Again, in South Asia, this problem is particularly acute. For one example, in the brothels of India, there are over 200,000 Nepalese women and children languishing there as a result of human trafficking. Of course, this is not an isolated crime. It's tied, as most of these are, to organized crimes. Many times, it's tied in with drug smuggling, tied in with arms, and most recently, allegations of terrorist connections, both in South Asia and coming across the border that we share with Mexico. Brian Willis will talk about the public health implications of this problem, but as you can imagine, they are tremendous. I am just going to talk about one example, and that's the impact of HIV. So in some of the brothel areas in India, where you have a high percentage of trafficked individuals, upwards of 80% of the women and children are HIV positive. Which brings us to the Daywalka Foundation. Daywalka is a pseudonym for the first trafficking survivor that ever told us her story in Nepal over 10 years ago. And it's a story that helps ground us, because it is very easy in this process to get lost in facts and figures and numbers and policy debates. And it's always important to remember that there are human beings behind these numbers, and the people that we do and the actions that we serve should serve their interests. As Doug also pointed out, I am a former attorney and a prosecutor at that, and several of the founders of Daywalka are also attorneys. And because of that, in our experience, one of the things that we've come to believe is that strong rule of law and strengthening law enforcement is one of the keys to preventing trafficking, whether it would be domestically or internationally. So as a result, we work with judges, lawyers, prosecutors, criminal investigations, and social service agencies to empower them to do their jobs better abroad. The model focuses around what's called Women and Children's Security Resource Centers. These are collaborative spaces where groups can come together, and we provide incentives for them to work together to combat the spread of trafficking. At the heart of this And attorneys sometimes can take a bad rap, but at the heart of this, one of the most effective ways that we have found in order to ensure justice is provided to victims and survivors are hiring panels and private attorneys to help represent those victims and survivors. They help provide them access to all services of justice, not just health care, but they assist with prosecution, they provide reintegration or repatriation programs and job training as necessary. So I'll just provide one concrete example. One of the typical situations in India, if a child is trafficked into a brothel and they're rescued, very quickly there's a custody hearing, because the majority of them are under 18. So there's a custody hearing in front of a panel, in front of a judge or a custody panel that happens 24 to 48 hours. Generally, the NGO, the non-governmental organization, shows up to try to argue for custody, but they are not alone. Generally, what we call the fake parents show up as well, which are some of the conduits to the traffickers. Of course, they make these arguments. Unless you have effective legal representation at that point, the judge has to rule that the child will go back to the fake parents, who are in effect the traffickers, and you can imagine what happens then. The child is immediately re-trafficked to another part where we can't get a hold of them, or worse. But this is not just a problem internationally, it is a problem domestically as well. There are two types of trafficking victims generally here in the United States. You have the international victim that's brought in from somewhere outside of the United States. Again, numbers are all over the place, but the most recent numbers are around 20,000 people trafficked into the United States, and most of those coming across the border that we share with Mexico. The other type of trafficking victim we have in the United States is the American citizen, and most of those are children. Indeed, the Department of Justice estimates that 300 to 400,000 children are active in the commercial sex trade in the United States, which is a staggering figure. Just in the last, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of cases that have just come up in the last couple of months, and they appear in places you wouldn't expect them. Toledo, Ohio, 2 months ago, had an enormous trafficking ring that was broken up by law enforcement authorities. And what these individuals were doing was recruiting runaways and then shipping them out to truck stops and motels, not only in the Midwest, but around the United States. Additionally, last month alone in Houston, there was a trafficking case with international victims with over 100 victims that came across the border with Mexico, promised jobs as waitresses. Their debt was then sold to a trafficker who forced them into prostitution. What is the situation here in Oregon? And some of my other colleagues can give you an in-depth look at that as well. We don't have a ton of information, but we do have some information. As Doug alluded to, the December 7th edition of the Willamette Weekly article highlighted the case of Mr. Hernandez Gomez that came up through Honduras, willingly across the border, promised a job, and then his debt was sold to a drug dealer, and he ended up selling heroin. Doing interviews with both law enforcement, criminal defense attorneys, and social service providers, that this is not an uncommon story. And indeed, this connection with Honduran teenagers ending up in Portland and selling drugs seems to be much more than a coincidence. I can report there are current investigations going on in all areas of this state that deal with sexual exploitation, forced labor, migrant labor, and then those that also involve drugs. And this is particularly where the crossroads of trafficking and narcotics meet. Most recently, there has been trafficking involved in the methamphetamine trade, and one of the most recent cases that it's making its way through the system indeed involves the trading of children for drugs, and in one very unfortunate case, done by relatives of that child that were addicted to methamphetamine. So I'm going to conclude here, but I'm going to do it with a little story. And whenever I talk to my students about these things, they always accuse me of bumming them out and depressing them because they feel helpless and overwhelmed. And indeed, it is a hard story. But whenever I travel overseas, I am always struck by the resilience of the human spirit and humans to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. And one of the programs that the Daywalka Foundation has is called Project Kalam, Margins Right. And kalam is a word for pen in several South Asian languages. And it's a creative writing and poetry program. And I just want to read to you one of the poems that a 14-year-old participant, and I will end here, and then I think Liz will talk a little more. And it's just called Introduction. From among the cluster of birds, I am one, brilliant white like a question mark, neither warm nor cool, a stone discarded, or a quiet floating cloud through which I soar to touch the blue sky. When I couldn't fly, I lay restive, like a soft pillow. Beckoned by the smell of the wind, I fly now, in the blue skies, a gift of God. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to, on behalf of Catholic Charities and the Catholic Charities Anti-Human Trafficking Program, I want to thank Portland City Club for inviting us to be here today, as well as, again, thanking all of you for your time and your interest. What I'm going to really just try and go over in this short amount of time is tell you a little bit about our program, what we do, kind of pick up where Chris left off is, you know, the constant question that we always get is trafficking happening here in Portland? What are we seeing? And what are we doing about it? And then go over some of the challenges of you know, addressing this issue as a social service provider, and what are some of the challenges that we're facing in working with some of these cases. So to start off, Catholic Charities received a grant in October, or we started the program in October of 2004. This is a grant coming out of the Department of Justice, out of the Office of Victims of Crime. And what this grant did, it gave us two really main responsibilities. One was to really get out there and create some education and awareness among service providers who were assuming that would have the potential to run into victims of human trafficking, but also to provide direct assistance and ways of taking care of basic needs, emergency assistance, for victims of human trafficking. Currently, we are the only program funded in the state to directly address this issue, and we're the first program in the state to directly provide direct services to victims of human trafficking. So the initial grant, we reapplied, and when we reapplied, it came with a partnership with a law enforcement agency. And I'm very pleased to say that Multnomah County Sheriff's Department really stepped up, and it's been really a great experience working with them thus far. This partnership is really new, just pretty much started I think in like October of this year, and we have one full-time deputy, his name Deputy Dan Rondon, who works with us out of the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, and he's been really great. He's got quite a lot on his plate, but there was, I think, with this second or the renewal of the grant, they really realized the need for a partnership between law enforcement and NGOs. I think this situation really creates a unique dynamic. It kind of makes everyone, what I've been saying lately is everyone play nice together that don't traditionally work together. We're putting social services with law enforcement, with legal advocates, and that's really, it sounds really simple, but it's really, as I'm discovering, a lot more complex than I ever thought it would be. But we are really lucky here in Portland. I feel that we have both our federal and our local law enforcement agencies have really come on board quite strongly and are really supportive. And not only are supportive of their own, you know, the criminal side of it, but are very victim-centered, which for us as social service providers, you know, really kind of excites us in this as we move forward in this together. We also have a second grant out of the Department of Health and Human Services, and this provides outreach and education. And this grant was really primarily for victim identification. What was happening is there are these programs that are set up throughout the country, and we're not meeting the numbers that they're thinking that we need to meet. And this is largely due to lack of, I think, not only lack of awareness and education, but also, I think we're facing a little bit of anti-immigrant sentiment. And then we're facing a lot of, it's a really hard issue, and it doesn't happen here. People want to think that it just doesn't happen here in this community, but indeed it is. What is kind of happening, so that's kind of our program, in general. In terms of direct services, again, it's the basic needs. We work with our Catholic Charities immigration team to provide the legal advocacy. So, because most of the victims that we have seen are non-U.S. citizens, and most are undocumented. Some actually are documented and documented legally, but most are not. So most of these victims really are in a state of extreme vulnerability because you're here, you're here illegally, and someone has your documents, or whatever documents they are, whether they're false or true or not. So trafficking in Portland. When we think about Portland and the geographic location, California currently is the #1 state in terms of, trafficking activity in the country. And Washington also has a lot of trafficking activity, and we're right in the middle. We're right off the I-5 corridor, which makes it very convenient. Chris referred to Honduran youth being trafficked and forced to sell drugs. A few months ago, I was up at a training in Washington, and I was talking to an attorney who was representing a Honduran youth, or who had represented a Honduran youth who escaped from Portland. And just to give you a little bit of the severity, he had tried to leave previous to the time where he was actually successful, and what happened, and he ended up losing his arm. They cut off his arm when he tried to leave. So just to give you a little bit of severity of really, these people are threatened if they leave, threatened to themselves, but also threats to family back home, which is a very powerful and very realistic threat. And along with that, I think Portland is really unique in a lot of ways, but one of the ways is that in the nation, we have the most strip clubs per capita. So I think that, to me, it would be very hard to say that nothing is going on, no trafficking at all is going on in the way of forced prostitution with that kind of statistic. So, and we're seeing, like Chris said, there are ongoing investigations, and in a lot of the investigations, we are kind of one of the midpoints. Portland is one of the midpoints. Stuff is happening in Seattle, stuff is happening in California, and it's also being routed through Portland. So what we're seeing really is, we're seeing different types of trafficking. We're seeing the forced labor, the forced illegal activity, and we're seeing, we actually, to date, we don't have a case of any forced prostitution, which is a little bit of alarming to me. Because we're hearing a lot, what happens is we have a referral line. We have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week referral line, as well as our office phones. And when we go out and we talk to people and service providers who work directly with the communities, we get a lot of stories. We get a lot of, they know exactly what we're talking about when we describe the dynamics of trafficking, when we describe some of the activity. They know exactly what we're talking about. But because and especially when we talk about the ethnic communities here in the Portland area and even throughout the state, they're very small communities. So, word spreads like wildfire. So no one wants to be the one who, basically who snitched on everyone else. And we're also seeing both youth and adults. So it is happening with adults, and it is happening with both male and female minors. Some of the challenges that we're looking at is that it's new. This is new for everyone, particularly our state. So it's new for law enforcement, for social service providers, and for legal advocates. And it's, and as you get into the process of from, discovering a victim and working with that victim to, get them to a point to be able to bring out their story and have them be seen by law enforcement and anyone else as a victim of trafficking, it's a fairly extensive process, and it's very, very hard and can be very traumatizing on the victim after, such a horrific experience, and now they essentially have to relive it by telling everyone else, by telling law enforcement, various law enforcement agencies, their lawyer, and things like that. And then, so we're, with everyone, if you think about all the players involved, one, it's a hardship for the victim because they have to they have to tell their story to all these different people involved. And also, all the different people involved were not used to working together. Previous to this, we didn't have working relationships, and we all have very different roles. They're all equally important, but sometimes, sometimes we get in the way of each other. So it's a process of sorting that out. I think it could go without saying that the lack of resources for the victims here in the state, there's a tremendous lack, especially when we talk about cultural competency or language capacity. And, people don't want, as far as services are concerned, if you are undocumented and you don't have the any language capacity in the English language, it's very hard. And you don't have insurance, it's hard to get into, to get some of your needs met. Another challenge that I really would like to address is that currently there are no services for domestic or U.S. citizen victims of trafficking. Our service grant out of the Department of Justice is solely for non-U.S. citizens, and that's because the assumption was made that most, if not all, trafficking victims were coming out of the country. As Chris said, we're seeing more and more that domestic trafficking is happening with U.S. citizens, especially, again, I'll highlight, there's the tremendous meth problem that we're all aware of. And people do crazy things when they're, taking crazy substances. And so we have seen some cases where people are selling their children for drugs, and those are U.S. citizens. So, and to not have services for them. Again, there's a lack of resources for the victims that we're responsible for serving. We would like to, be able to extend our services to U.S. citizens, but currently there are no services. So that's a huge, huge challenge. I'm not sure where I am in my 10 minutes. I totally lost time. Okay. But essentially, that's really it in a nutshell. It's pretty exciting to be here in Portland right now, and for the state of Oregon. I think we're really just starting to fully tackle the issue of human trafficking. Our neighbors in Washington have offered a lot of support and guidance as to what they're doing. And as a program and as an agency, we also look for guidance to other national organizations that have been doing this for a few years longer than we have, both in New York and down in LA, where there's huge hubs. There have been huge hubs of trafficking activity. So we currently, another challenge is that currently we don't have any state legislation. We don't have any state laws against trafficking, which makes it a little difficult, especially when we're talking about going after the traffickers. And that's what a lot of victims want. They want to be safe, and they want this to stop. They don't want it to happen to anyone else, and they want the people who are doing this to be stopped and to be punished. And so it's really hard when you're I don't have any background in law, but I've had to learn really quickly that it's really difficult when you're working with just under a federal law without any state legislation support to really go after these traffickers, because I didn't realize that that discretional on cases, I guess, that are picked up by federal courts. So that as a social service provider, as kind of a whiny, touchy-feely service provider, that really is quite frustrating, because we hear these people's stories, we work with them on a daily basis, and when they ask us, is my trafficker going to be punished? I've worked with law enforcement, I've given you guys all this information, what's going to happen? And for us to say, well, something's being looked into, and maybe nothing will happen, and what we need to do is just focus on, things for you right now. We do the best with them that we can, but, there's kind of that overhanging, they're still out there type of thing. So that, Chris, Brian, and I are, trying to work with some folks to really push some legislation, some state legislation for this. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. We're a client-centered program, so anything the client, when you look at the TVPA or the trafficking law, there's requirements for victims to, in order for them to be eligible for certain benefits. I won't get into that, but we're really client-centered, and I have to always stress to other service providers that even though we have a really good relationship with both our local and our federal law enforcement agencies, that we're not obligated to report people to immigration or report people for, to the police. If people come to us, we have to meet them where they're at, and we have to make sure that they are getting to where they need or they want to be. And if that's a place of, working with law enforcement, then so be it. But if, it takes a little longer, then, we all have to wait. And so I think patience from all of us, both social service providers and law enforcement, and the legal advocates, is a real necessity. Because I think when I started, I think really most recently, the stories that I've heard is really, you see the documentaries on TV and you see the movies, and it's, and it's this you don't walk away or shut off the TV feeling good about anything. But I think it really, to me, it's a much more tremendous and a huge reality check when someone is sitting right in front of you, telling you how, how they were kidnapped, how they were deceived by a longtime family friend, how they've seen various abuses and sometimes murders and the conditions that they've been kept in. It's, I hope that most of us can, go through our lives without, being exposed to these horrifying situations, but it really is. It's, I don't know, it's not the movies, it's real life. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd also like to thank the City Club and Professor Rose for organizing this presentation today. And also my hat's off to Liz and Chris for all the work that they've done. Also, I know our COO from Daywalka is here, Chris Parsons. He can answer any questions for you also about the work that we do. So I've been asked to address specifically what are some of the health harms associated with trafficking. And let me tell you, my work is primarily associated with looking at the public health impact of sex trafficking. What does that mean? It boils down to this. It's about prostitution. Now, the work that I've been doing going back to 1990 predates the Palermo Protocol that Chris mentioned. It's really sort of putting a new term on an old issue. The term we use now is human trafficking or sex trafficking. Really what it's about is prostitution. So there are three basic populations that I look at. There are prostituted youth. Under the definition, we look at anyone under 18 years of age. There are adults who are forced into prostitution. And then there's another category that we're not talking about, people who are not trafficked and people who refer themselves as voluntary sex workers. Now, who's trafficked? Well, clearly under the Paloma Protocol, all children who are prostituted are trafficking victims. We don't need to show any force, fraud, or coercion. Why not? Well, it's pretty simple. We hold children to a different level of needs. We don't require them to show what adults show, that they've been forced into prostitution. We're simply trying to protect these kids. There's so much fear that goes into what happens to them. We don't want them to have to show anything else. So all children who are forced into are prostituted, they are de facto trafficking victims. How many are there? According to UNICEF, there are about 1 million children forced into prostitution globally every day. That breaks down to 27,397 every day of the year. In the time we sit here, that's 1,141 children, 19 children per minute. I think that number is a little bit deceiving, though, because it talks about the number that are pushed in each year. Really what we need to do is aggregate those numbers. It depends on the number of cohorts we look at, but at a minimum, probably 7. So about 7 million children are prostituted throughout the world every day. How do we compare that with other issues? Many people have also heard of exploitation of children through in war. There are child soldiers. There's about 300,000 children who are forced to fight in wars. On the other hand, another comparison, I think, is female genital mutilation. And UNICEF estimates about 2 million girls are subjected to female genital mutilation every year. So that kind of gives you some comparison. Chris mentioned the number of children in the United States who are forced into prostitution. One of those studies was published, Timing's Everything. It came out September 10th, 2001. So it didn't get a whole lot of airplay, but it estimates that up to 325,000 American children are prostituted or somehow sexually exploited in the United States. Now, there are 2 broad categories of children who are sexually exploited through prostitution. There are the children who are pimped, just like what we would think of, pimps forcing kids into prostitution. Then there are homeless youth who are on the street. They are sexually exploited also. Sometimes people will pimp them, but they're still homeless youth. Other times, homeless youth are sexually exploited because of their needs. It's often referred to as survival sex. So the next group we look at are adult women. Again, there are just millions and millions of women throughout the world who, as Chris mentioned, don't necessarily cross international borders, but they're still forced into prostitution within their own countries. I've done some work in Calcutta. Just within Calcutta, one organization I work with works with 40,000 women who are prostituted. They use the term sex worker. I don't use that term. Just in the state of West Bengal, where Calcutta is, there's 100,000. So the numbers within countries are very, very large. So what are some of the health problems that we look at? I break them down into 7 categories. The first is the one most people would associate with this issue, infectious diseases, primarily HIV. Where HIV is common, and where it's common not just in a country, but in the population of women who are sexually exploited, it can be very high. Chris mentioned some places where it's 80%. In many African countries, 70% of prostituted women are infected with HIV. That gets the big play. Everyone knows about that. But in some places, HIV rates aren't so high. Many places in South America, for example. So there, you have to look at what are other problems that they have. It's not, even though HIV gets most of the attention, these women have many, many other health problems, what I refer to as a lot of comorbidity. So in addition to HIV, they also have a lot of STIs. Now, when you look at the reams and reams of research papers, you would think that these women don't have any problems other than HIV and STIs. You take care of that and everything's fine. Well, unfortunately, A lot of the research is simply driven by the donors. The donors want to combat HIV. They do research on HIV and sex workers. They find out that STIs promote the transmission of HIV, so they do another big bolus of studies on STIs. What they're not looking at, though, are many of the other related health issues. For example, tuberculosis. If you have tuberculosis, if you have HIV, you're at high risk for tuberculosis. But there's not good studies on this relationship. There's very little data also on Hep B and Hep B and Hep C, or HPV. There's also very little study on the next category, non-infectious diseases. For example, there's very little data on malnutrition among these women and their children. A lot of them also suffer from very serious dental diseases or skin infections. The next category is reproductive health problems. Much of this is simply related to lack of access to reproductive health services. Most of these women and children do not have access to reproductive health services. This results in high rates of pregnancies. If they're pregnant, they have limited options. Often they choose to have an abortion, usually it's unsafe, or other times they're forced to have an abortion. I think that where HIV rates are low, unsafe abortions are probably among the highest risk to prostituted women and girls throughout the world. If they carry the pregnancy through, they also have very high risk. 500,000 women and girls die during childbirth per year. Unfortunately, we don't disaggregate the data well enough to know how many of these deaths occur among prostituted women and girls. We also know that 13% of those deaths, or 65,000 deaths per year, are due to unsafe abortion. Again, I know that very many prostituted women and girls have unsafe abortions. I expect that probably more than 13% of these women have deaths are due to unsafe abortions. And also there's a lot of complication just in other population of women who are subjected to unsafe abortion. 10 to 50% of them suffer complications. I've seen women who drink poisons to induce abortions. In Rwanda, they drink laundry detergent mixed with glycerol in order to induce abortions. They do very, very dangerous things to themselves, and so there's a high risk of complications or death. The next health risk to these women is due to substance abuse. For some women and children, is associated with abusing drugs to begin with. When they exhaust all their resources, oftentimes their last resort is to turn to prostitution. Other times, a lot of women and children self-medicate with drugs. They have such a horrible life that this is what they do. I was talking with this girl. She was 16 years old. She was trafficked in Pakistan. And while we were sitting there talking, she started smoking. And I asked her why she was doing that. And she says, "My life is so horrible that I have no appetite." She goes, "I was wasting away to nothing." So she smokes hashish in order to stimulate an appetite. I think probably the next category is the largest health problem throughout the world for these women and children, and that's mental health issues. Many of these women and children become so depressed that they lose their will to escape. Many of them resort to suicide. I just came back from a project in India where we heard that perhaps at least 50% of the women we interviewed had attempted suicide, many of them through drinking poisons, others through trying to throw themselves down a well. In other parts of India, girls leap in front of trains. So it's a very serious problem. It also makes our other efforts very complicated. If these women and children have so many severe mental health problems, I'm not really sure how people think they're going to get AIDS education messages to them. These women, I think, and children are worried about a lot of other issues. So without a doubt, you need AIDS education information to get to them to prevent HIV. But with these severe mental health problems, with a lot of depression, suicide, and anxiety and PTSD, I'm not really sure how those messages resonate with them. They're worried about surviving today, not necessarily dying of AIDS in 10 years from now. The next issue is violence. The violence is part and parcel to sex trafficking and prostitution. It is often involving rape, murder, and beatings. The largest serial murder in U.S. history, talking about what happens in this country, happened not far from here, up in Seattle, the Green River murders. 38 prostituted adult women were murdered, and 9 girls. Almost 20% of the victims were under 18 years old. I understand that the largest serial murderer in Oregon involved the murder of prostituted women and kids. The violence takes a horrible toll also on them mentally. I remember this woman in southern India, after an interview, just looking at me and saying, "How can I get out of this hell?" And I think that's she said, I think, what a lot of these people think. Again, the violence, this project I just came back on, it was reported that a pregnant woman was stabbed to death. The last category that is not talked about very often, but is a major issue, and that is many of these women have kids. And the trafficking and prostitution of women and girls has a profound impact either when the child's in utero or at birth or as the child's growing up. Again, from HIV perspective, a lot of kids are infected with HIV, also other STIs in utero. Oftentimes the mother dies from HIV or tuberculosis or violence. She leaves her kids. They're picked up by another woman or by a pimp. It happens in the U.S. as well. I interviewed this woman in New York 2 summers ago, 7 months pregnant, working the street, had her baby. 3 months later, she's back on the street, and she was murdered. They couldn't find her family. The child's left as a ward of the state. So what does this mean for Portland? Well, you know, I know that there's a lot of emphasis on the international component of it, and I've seen it a lot myself, but I know also that there's a lot of sex trafficking of American women and children in this city. So without a doubt, we need to focus on helping the women and children who are trafficked here from other countries, but I think we also have to really commit ourselves to working on helping the American women and children, the women and children from Oregon and from Portland who are also forced into prostitution and the sex trade. What are the solutions? There's a joke, if you ask a surgeon, you know, what should I do? He'll always say, operate. Well, you ask a researcher, what should you do? And well, my first response would be, we need some research. Not that the research is the solution. We need the research in order to point the way to the solutions. So just a couple of specific suggestions. First is raise awareness. Many people don't associate human trafficking with these other issues. I think we can start with kids also, making kids aware of this issue. In fact, my own kids said, what can we do? And they started a project. It's called CAT, Kids Against Trafficking. They made T-shirts. They raised awareness in their school. There's one of their T-shirts on the back there. They said, Dad, take our T-shirts. Show people. I think we also need to develop strategies to address other facets of this issue. You need to have a strategy for each population, kids, whether they're pimped or homeless, adult women, whether they're American or from another country. We need a coalition that's driven by results and action and not divided by personal or professional turf issues. We need medical and public health professionals to join in. We need the homeless youth agencies to collaborate with the police. Whatever problems or misunderstandings there have been in the past between these two agencies, we need to overcome them. And we need a safe location for women and children where they can be protected, just as we have for victims of domestic violence. I'd like to end with a proposal. As a starting point, I'd like to see Portland declare itself as the first city in the nation to have a zero tolerance for human trafficking. This has not been done elsewhere. If we're opposed to human trafficking everywhere else, we ought to oppose it here too, and we ought to say so. Thank you.
We'll now open the program to questions. Questions are a privilege for City Club members only. Our first question will come from our board host, Gwen Milius. Gwen is a member of the Board of Governors and our new Leaders Council liaison. She's a partner with SRM Architecture and Marketing Incorporated. Gwen?
Thank you to the panel for your presentation today. I was wondering if there's any evidence that tighter border security post September 11th has affected the likelihood that people who are desperate to get into this country end up being entrapped in human trafficking more often now than before that incident. And then also on the other side of it, when they're rescued from trafficking, if they're here illegally and they do decide to pursue legal action against their traffickers, what their relationship with the INS becomes, if they have any right to asylum or if they're in effect going to be deported as well.
I'll just do the quick first part and then I'll turn it to Liz over. I think we have seen an increase in trafficking, and certainly whether it's an increase or whether we're just becoming more aware of it, we certainly have these estimates of individuals coming across the borders and more incidences of those. So, I think we've seen an increase in this not just here in the United States, but also, I think, worldwide. And I know.
As far as the relationship with immigration, if people choose to pursue whether it's their own immigration relief or civil suits or any kind of reparation from their traffickers. As far as the relationship with ICE, and I can say that I've spoken with several local ICE agents here in Portland, and they are committed, again, to the victim-centered approach. And a victim is a victim, and the law has put it so that a victim where before the law were treated as illegal illegal immigrants, they maybe were let to stay here for any criminal investigation or anything like that, and then essentially were deported. Now the law has restructured that, and if a victim is a victim and ICE agrees, or immigration agrees, law enforcement agrees that they are indeed a victim, then they do have rights and privileges and they can pursue legal status here in this country. And that's what, that's one of the things that we help some of our clients do. If that's their choice, then that's what they do. But yeah, I think there's a large perception of immigration is just out to gather all the illegals and undocumented people around and just deport them and get rid of them. But they certainly give a lot of room to hearing people's stories and treating victims as victims.
My name is Don Gale. I'm the president and CEO of Gale Associates, and we own and operate many businesses in many states in the United States. In 1908, my parents came to the United States from the Ukraine through the port of Galveston, Texas. Ship captains were being paid money by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad because of the devastation caused by the hurricane that hit Galveston in 1900. From 1908 to 1912, my grandfather and 4 of his brothers laid track on the railroad and ended up in Kansas City, Missouri, where they founded a department store company that's as large as Meyer and Frank. In fact, my grandfather and Jerry Frank's grandfather were close friends. My grandfather and John Nordstrom were friends. We talk about this issue. I have a serious problem. I've worked in the White House for 8 years. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 22 years. I now live in a city that can't provide education for our own children. We do not have a foreign sex problem here. The sheriff walked out. My uncle served with him on the Oregon State Police. My question is, why are we spending so much time deliberating on this issue in Oregon that is non-existent?
I'm not sure that we have spent that much time. I mean, this legislature is considering the first human trafficking bill ever this upcoming session. And I think there's a larger population other than just foreign people coming here for commercial sex work. And I think one of the people said they don't have any cases there, but it's larger. You have migrant work. And I think there's been a fairly documented populations and connections. And I think the suggestion is that in limited resources, you need to make hard decisions, but that this is an issue. It affects not just Oregon, but all of the United States, I think. I don't know if Liz or Brian.
No, I mean, I the only thing that I can say is that it does exist here, and I don't know, I wouldn't, you know, and we have people that are living proof that it exists here. The government believes it exists, the law enforcement agencies believe it exists, so therefore I have to be inclined to also believe that it exists.
Lily Mandel, City Club member. What happens if a Portland parent is caught selling a child for meth? What charge is brought and by whom?
Okay, so if there is a individual, well, first of all, they're subject to any both state drug charges and federal charges. There are also criminal neglect charges for children that range from both misdemeanors to felonies that would also be applicable as well. I would think that the local district attorney's office would probably also begin termination proceedings of those parental rights. So those are remedies that exist right now for those. In addition, there is the federal crime of human trafficking, which I would certainly make a very strong argument in that case that would apply.
My name is Gavin White. I'm a City Club member. I'm also the chair of the Multnomah County Democratic Party. Thank you very much for coming out today to speak with us about this very important issue. Chris, you gave us a definition of trafficking, the crux of which seems to be that an employer is maintaining an exploitative working condition through coercion, that is a human trafficker. One obvious local answer to this is to make trafficking itself illegal, and that's a great start here. But we, I think, would remain frustrated with our seeming inability to affect trafficking on a global scale. I'd like to offer one potential analysis of a solution and hear your comments on how you think this would impact trafficking globally. It seems that one of the drivers of the question is to have comments on this potential solution. That we drive trafficking economically. These exploited workers are producing goods, and it might be that we could have a policy that would prohibit us from buying goods from exploited workers. Can you comment on that and suggest potential parallels in the somewhat more sticky realms of the service industries and the illegal service industries here in Portland?
Sure, I'll try to answer that briefly. I think there's a good idea, and you have organizations that look to buy, fair trade good and products that are certified by workers both internationally and domestically, that those, labor standards are, either on par with the United States or on par with the country that they're serving in. And I think those are good elements, but I think to get an economic issue, we need to probably look at broader base concerns as well, and those are issues of poverty, lack of access to justice, and education as well. So.
Carol Witherall, City Club member. It seems to me that one of the biggest elephants in the center of our global living room is the repression of women's and children's rights around the globe, from sexual to economic to full participation in civic life of society. What would happen if the United States were to sign on to the UN's Declaration of Human Rights for Children? Could this make a difference, including here at home, in our own country, in our own city?
Brian, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the General Assembly in 1989. It was ratified in 1990. Only 2 countries in the world have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the U.S. and Somalia. I believe that words have meaning and that they can be used for good purposes. I believe that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a very good instrument for getting governments to do what they're committed to do under the Convention. And it's been used very effectively. The Convention on the Rights of the Child states that governments must protect children from being sexually exploited through prostitution and from being trafficked, and governments must help these children in recovery. Now, that being said, the U.S. has ratified and adopted the optional protocol to the CRC, which specifically addresses child soldiers and child prostitution, and the optional protocol is primarily focused on law enforcement issues. So while we haven't ratified the convention, at least we have ratified the optional protocol. And that has led, I believe, or contributed to some of the laws on trafficking.
Chris Wu, City Club member. Thanks very much for being here today. My first job out of college was resettling international refugees. And I know that, while not perfect, there is an established system of support. There are resources for refugees to be able to build more secure lives in their sponsoring communities. What sorts of resources are there? What sorts of systems of support are there for human trafficking survivors to build more secure lives for them? And maybe more importantly, what systems of support would you like to see in the future? Thanks.
The big one that Liz mentioned is a T visa, which is kind of where you get to stay if you've been a victim and either participate or not in a federal prosecution. I think what we would like to see, as Liz said, funds are extremely limited for these victims, both international and domestically. So that would be the first option. But the second option is, I think, taking this model of private legal representation for the victims that can ensure their rights and access to justice and access to community and an access to reintegration. It seems to be working very well abroad and also bridging this gap with law enforcement. And we just believe really strongly that would work here as well.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our program. Would you join me in thanking our panel? And we're adjourned.